Some promises are stronger than time. Stronger than memory. Stronger even than the people who make them. Every morning at exactly 6:15 a.m., before the first school bus rolled through town and before the bakery opened its doors on Main Street, a German shepherd named Ranger slipped through the side gate of Cedar Creek Animal Shelter and ran. No one knew why. The volunteers had tried following him before. A few lasted a day. One lasted a week. Eventually they all gave up. The dog always followed the same route, cutting across a patch of dew-soaked grass, trotting along an old gravel road, and disappearing beyond a line of maple trees whose leaves whispered softly in the early morning breeze. Then, about an hour later, he always returned. Quiet. Polite. Tired. As if he had completed a task no one else could understand. Ranger was 7 years old, though grief had a way of making him seem older. His sable coat was still handsome, thick around the neck and shoulders, but his amber eyes carried the weight of a creature who had spent too many mornings hoping for something that never came. The shelter records offered few answers. Found wandering near the county line. No microchip. No known owner. Friendly temperament. Excellent with people. Yet every employee agreed on one thing. Ranger never truly belonged to the shelter. It was as though his body stayed there while his heart remained somewhere else entirely. On a chilly October morning, Ethan Walker noticed him for the first time. Ethan was 41, a former Marine who had recently moved back to Cedar Creek after years of drifting from one temporary job to another. The town looked smaller than he remembered. Quieter. The old storefronts seemed faded around the edges, and the familiar streets carried memories he wasn't always eager to revisit. He had started volunteering at the shelter mostly because he needed something to fill the silence. Too many evenings alone had taught him that empty hours could become dangerous companions. That morning, while unloading bags of dog food from his pickup truck, he spotted Ranger standing near the fence. The dog wasn't barking. Wasn't playing. He was staring toward the eastern horizon where dawn painted the clouds in pale shades of gold and silver. There was something unusual about the way he watched. Not curiosity. Not distraction. Expectation. Like someone waiting for a familiar face to appear around a corner. "There he goes," said Martha Green, the shelter manager, carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Ranger slipped through the gate and broke into a steady run. Ethan glanced after him. "Where's he headed?" Martha sighed. "Old bus stop on County Road 12. Every day. Every single day." Ethan watched the dog disappear into the morning mist. "What's at the bus stop?" Martha gave a small shrug. "That's the strange part." "Nothing." Ethan wasn't sure why those words stayed with him all morning. Maybe it was the sadness in Ranger's eyes. Maybe it was because he recognized something familiar in a creature who couldn't let go of the past. Or maybe it was because some mysteries don't ask for permission before they settle inside your mind. The next morning, before sunrise painted the sky, Ethan arrived early. He parked a quarter-mile from the shelter and waited. At exactly 6:15, Ranger slipped through the gate again. Without hesitation, without looking back, the German shepherd started down the same lonely path he had followed for years. This time, someone finally followed him. The old bus stop sat at the edge of County Road 12 like a forgotten memory. Its faded wooden bench leaned slightly to one side, and the shelter above it carried decades of sun, rain, and winter snow in every crack and stain. Grass pushed through the pavement. Wildflowers grew where people once stood in line. The route itself had been discontinued nearly 10 years earlier, after a new highway redirected traffic away from Cedar Creek. Most residents barely remembered it existed. Ranger approached the stop without slowing. Ethan remained about 50 yards behind, careful not to disturb whatever ritual the dog had been performing all these years. The morning air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves. Somewhere in the distance, a tractor engine hummed to life. A flock of geese crossed overhead, their calls echoing across the pale October sky. Ranger stepped beneath the weathered shelter and sat. Not casually. Not like a dog resting after a run. He sat with purpose. His ears stood alert. His eyes remained fixed on the empty road stretching toward town. Ethan waited. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Ranger never moved. The dog seemed completely absorbed by something invisible. Ethan studied him from behind a nearby oak tree. The posture reminded him of Marines standing watch during long deployments. Hours of patience. Absolute focus. The belief that something important could appear at any moment. 20 minutes later, Ranger finally rose. Slowly, almost reluctantly. He walked to the far end of the shelter and lowered his nose to the ground. Ethan watched him sniff a patch of cracked concrete before returning to the bench again. The movement felt familiar. Practiced. Like something he had done thousands of times before. When Ranger eventually turned toward the shelter to begin the trip back, Ethan stepped forward. The German shepherd stopped immediately. For a moment, neither moved. Amber eyes met hazel ones. There was no fear in Ranger's expression. No surprise. Only a quiet sadness that seemed far older than the dog himself. Ethan crouched. "What are you waiting for out here, buddy?" Ranger simply stared. Then he glanced toward the road one more time. Ethan followed the direction of his gaze. Nothing. Just empty pavement disappearing into the morning light. Yet something about that final look tightened a knot deep inside his chest. After Ranger trotted away, Ethan remained behind. Curiosity pulled him toward the bench. The wood creaked softly beneath his hand as he brushed away years of dust and leaves. That was when he noticed the carving. It was hidden beneath the seat where most people would never think to look. Time had faded the letters, but they were still visible. Ethan leaned closer. Someone had carefully carved a single word into the wood years ago. Ranger. He stared at the name for several seconds. The shelter record said nobody knew where the dog had come from. Nobody knew who had owned him. Yet here, at an abandoned bus stop miles from anywhere, his name had been waiting all along. Ethan ran his fingers across the grooves. The carving was old. Very old. The edges had softened from years of weather. Whoever had written it had known the dog long before he ever arrived at Cedar Creek Animal Shelter. A cold breeze drifted through the shelter, carrying the faint scent of pine and distant chimney smoke. Ethan stood quietly, staring at the carved letters. For the first time, he realized Ranger was not returning here because he was lost. He was returning because he remembered. And somewhere beyond this forgotten road and this forgotten bench was a story that neither time nor loneliness had managed to erase. For the rest of that day, the carved name stayed in Ethan's mind. He tried focusing on routine tasks around the shelter. Cleaning kennels. Repairing a damaged fence panel. Organizing supplies in the storage room. But every time he glanced across the yard and saw Ranger lying quietly beneath his favorite oak tree, he found himself thinking about the old bus stop. About the worn letters hidden beneath the bench. About a dog who had spent years returning to the same place without missing a single morning. Late that afternoon, Ethan carried a folder into Martha Green's office. The shelter manager looked up from her desk and adjusted her reading glasses. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting thin golden stripes across stacks of paperwork. "You found something, did you not?" she asked. Ethan placed the folder on the desk. "I need everything we have on Ranger." Martha leaned back in her chair. "That is not much." She opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a thin manila folder. The file looked surprisingly small for a dog who had spent years at the shelter. Ethan opened it carefully. Intake date. Basic medical records. Vaccination history. Weight charts. Nothing unusual. Then he noticed a single handwritten note clipped near the back. Found near County Road 12. No identification. Friendly disposition. Estimated age, 4 years old. Ethan frowned. County Road 12. The same road as the bus stop. His eyes moved to the intake date. 3 years earlier. Almost exactly 3 years. Who brought him in? Ethan asked. Martha studied the file. A retired deputy. Named Walter Briggs. Does he still live around here? Martha nodded slowly. Small farm outside town. Why? Ethan looked through the office window toward the yard. Ranger lay in the shade, watching birds move through the branches overhead. Because I think Ranger has been trying to tell us something for a very long time. The next morning, after accompanying Ranger to the bus stop again, Ethan drove north toward the outskirts of Cedar Creek. Walter Briggs lived on 40 acres of farmland surrounded by rolling hills and aging fences. The farmhouse sat beneath towering cottonwood trees whose leaves shimmered in the autumn sunlight. Walter answered the door wearing faded overalls and carrying a coffee mug. His silver hair stuck out beneath a weathered baseball cap. You are the Marine volunteering at the shelter, he said before Ethan could introduce himself. Ethan smiled. Word travels fast. Walter chuckled. Small town. Everybody knows everybody. They sat on the front porch overlooking fields painted gold by the season. Ethan explained why he had come. The moment Ranger's name entered the conversation, Walter's expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. Like someone opening a door to an old room they had not visited in years. I remember that dog, Walter said quietly. Hard to forget him. Ethan leaned forward. Can you tell me where you found him? Walter stared toward the horizon for several seconds. Not where. When? Ethan waited. 3 years ago. Early October. I was driving home before sunrise when I saw him sitting at that old bus stop. Walter's voice softened. Just sitting there. Watching the road. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Was he lost? Walter slowly shook his head. That is the strange part. He did not look lost at all. A breeze moved through the cottonwoods. Their leaves rustled like distant whispers. Walter lowered his eyes to the coffee mug in his hands. He looked like he was waiting for somebody. Ethan felt the pieces beginning to move. Not enough to see the whole picture yet. But enough to know there was one. And somewhere beyond the bus stop, beyond the waiting, beyond 3 years of unanswered mornings, someone had once mattered enough for a loyal dog to keep believing they would come back. The following morning arrived wrapped in a thin blanket of fog that drifted across Cedar Creek like a memory refusing to fade. Ethan parked near the old bus stop before sunrise and waited alone. The world felt suspended between night and day. Dew clung to the tall grass. The distant silhouette of grain silos stood against a sky slowly brightening with soft shades of blue and gold. 20 minutes later, Ranger appeared. The German shepherd trotted down the familiar path and settled beneath the shelter exactly as he always did. Ethan remained hidden beside a cluster of maple trees. This time, however, he watched more carefully. Not the road. The dog. Ranger's ears shifted at certain sounds. A passing truck. The call of a crow. The rustle of wind through dry weeds. Yet every few moments his attention returned to the same location. Not the highway itself. Not the curve in the road. A specific spot roughly 100 yards away where an old gravel pull-off met the pavement. Ethan narrowed his eyes. The dog was not scanning randomly. He was watching a destination. As though expecting someone to appear from that exact place. After nearly 30 minutes, Ranger stood and walked toward the edge of the shelter. his nose lowered to the ground. Slowly he followed an invisible path through the weeds until he reached the far corner of the structure. Ethan waited until the dog returned to the shelter and settled back onto the bench. Then he quietly approached the area Ranger had been investigating. At first he saw nothing unusual. Weeds. Dirt. Fallen leaves. Then sunlight broke through the fog and reflected off something partially buried beneath the soil. Ethan knelt. Using his fingers, he carefully brushed away dirt and roots. A small piece of metal emerged. Tarnished by years of weather. Covered in rust and scratches. His breath caught slightly as he lifted it into the morning light. A military dog tag. Ethan turned it over. The lettering had faded but remained readable. His pulse quickened. The tag belonged to a man named Noah Bennett. United States Marine Corps. Ethan stared at the name. Around him, the world seemed to fall silent. Even the wind felt distant. Noah Bennett. The first real clue. The first proof that Ranger's story was connected to someone specific. Someone real. Ethan slipped the tag carefully into his jacket pocket and glanced back toward the shelter. Ranger was watching him now. The dog's amber eyes remained fixed on the object in Ethan's hand. Not anxious. Not protective. Almost hopeful. As if he recognized it. As if he had been waiting years for someone else to find it. Later that afternoon, Ethan drove to the Cedar Creek Public Library. The building smelled faintly of old books, floor polish, and coffee from a small machine near the entrance. Behind the front desk sat Eleanor Pierce, a retired schoolteacher who knew more local history than anyone in town. When Ethan showed her the dog tag, her expression changed immediately. Noah Bennett, she said softly. I have not heard that name in a very long time. Ethan leaned forward. You knew him? Eleanor nodded. Everyone did. Good young man. Joined the Marines right after high school. She paused. And if I remember correctly, he had a German shepherd that followed him everywhere. Ethan felt a chill move through him. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the library windows. Inside, another piece of the mystery quietly fell into place. Ranger had not been waiting for an idea. Or a memory. Or a habit. He had been waiting for a person. And for the first time, Ethan finally had a name. That evening, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table of his small rental house with a notebook, a cup of black coffee, and the dog tag resting beneath the warm glow of a single lamp. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The sound was steady and calming, but his thoughts refused to settle. Noah Bennett. The name felt strangely familiar, though Ethan could not place it. He opened his laptop and began searching through public records, local news archives, and military reunion pages. Hours passed. Most searches led nowhere. Then, just after midnight, he found an old newspaper article buried deep within the Cedar Creek Gazette archives. The headline was simple. Local Marine returns home after service. Overseas. A faded photograph accompanied the story. Ethan leaned closer. The young Marine stood in front of the very same bus stop on County Road 12. Beside him sat a German shepherd with bright amber eyes and oversized ears. Ranger. Younger. Healthier. But unmistakably the same dog. Ethan stared at the photograph for several seconds. The image felt almost alive. Noah's hand rested gently on the dog's shoulder. Both looked directly at the camera. Both looked happy. The article described Noah as a respected Marine who had returned to Cedar Creek to care for his aging mother after completing active service. Several months later, however, the trail abruptly ended. No recent interviews. No social media presence. No community records. It was as though Noah Bennett had simply vanished from the town's story. The next morning, Ethan visited Eleanor Pierce again. The librarian listened carefully while he explained what he had found. When he mentioned the disappearance, her expression grew thoughtful. There was a period when nobody knew where Noah had gone, she said quietly. People asked questions at first. Then life moved on. Ethan frowned. What happened? Eleanor folded her hands together. His mother passed away several years ago. After that, he became more private. Then one day he was simply gone. Did anyone report him missing? Not officially. Ethan glanced toward the window. That does not make sense. Eleanor nodded slowly. Small towns have a way of accepting silence when they should not. Before Ethan left, Eleanor disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a dusty storage box filled with old community event photographs. Together they sorted through dozens of images. County fairs. Veterans ceremonies. Holiday parades. Then Ethan found another photograph. This one stopped him cold. It showed Noah sitting on a park bench with Ranger lying beside him. On the back, written in faded blue ink, was a date from 4 years earlier and a short handwritten note. Best friends. Always together. Ethan turned the photograph over several times. Something about those words lingered. Always together. Yet somehow Ranger had ended up alone. Back at the shelter. That afternoon, Ethan sat beside Ranger beneath the oak tree. The German shepherd rested quietly in the grass, watching clouds drift overhead. Ethan held the photograph in his hand. I think you have been trying to lead someone here all along, he said softly. Ranger lifted his head. His amber eyes settled on the picture. Then, to Ethan's surprise, the dog stood and gently pressed his nose against Noah's image before looking away toward the eastern horizon. Toward the old road. Toward the place where he had waited every morning for 3 years. Ethan felt something shift inside him. This was no longer curiosity. No longer a puzzle. Somewhere out there was the missing chapter of a promise. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he knew he was not going to stop searching until he found it. 3 days later, the first real breakthrough arrived from a place Ethan never expected. Rain clouds hung low over Cedar Creek, turning the afternoon sky the color of weathered steel. Inside the library, Eleanor called him over to a table near the archives section. A collection of old community newsletters lay spread across the surface. I found something you should see, she said. Ethan pulled up a chair. Eleanor handed him a yellowed newsletter from 4 years earlier. Most of the pages contained routine announcements and church events. But one small article caught his attention. Local Veterans Outreach Program opens new recovery center. The center was located nearly 200 miles away in western Montana. Ethan almost turned the page until he noticed a familiar face in a group photograph attached to the article. He froze. Standing near the back of the crowd was Noah Bennett. The image was grainy and partially obscured, but it was clearly him. Older than the newspaper photo. Thinner. More reserved. Yet unmistakably Noah. Ethan felt his heart begin to race. This was published 4 years ago, he said quietly. Eleanor nodded. That means he was alive after everyone thought he disappeared. Ethan studied the photograph again. Something else stood out. Noah was alone. There was no sign of Ranger. No mention of a dog. No explanation. Just a single image that raised more questions than answers. That evening, Ethan drove home beneath steady rain and spent hours researching the recovery center. The facility still operated. It provided housing, counseling, and support for veterans rebuilding their lives after difficult transitions. The next morning, before sunrise, Ethan followed Ranger to the bus stop once more. The dog sat beneath the shelter exactly as he always did. Fog drifted across the road in pale ribbons. Ethan crouched beside him. "I think I found him," he whispered. Ranger turned his head. The amber eyes that met Ethan's seemed almost impossibly attentive. For a long moment neither moved. Then Ranger stood and walked toward the bench. He lowered his nose beneath the seat where his name had been carved years earlier. Ethan watched quietly. The dog sniffed the wood for several seconds before settling down beside it, as though guarding a memory. Later that day, Ethan contacted the recovery center. The woman who answered the phone was kind but cautious. Privacy rules prevented her from discussing current residents. Ethan understood. Still, before ending the call, he mentioned Noah Bennett's name. A brief silence followed. Then the woman spoke carefully. "I cannot share personal information," she said. "But if you are trying to reach someone important to him, you may want to send a letter." Ethan thanked her and hung up. The response was not confirmation. But it was not denial either. Hope entered the story for the first time. That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table and began writing. He explained everything. The shelter. The bus stop. The carved name. The dog tag. Most importantly, he described a German shepherd who had spent 3 years waiting every morning for someone who never arrived. When he finished, he sealed the envelope and addressed it to Noah Bennett at the recovery center. Before placing it in the mailbox the next morning, Ethan hesitated for a moment. The autumn air carried the scent of pine and would smoke through the quiet neighborhood. Somewhere across town, Ranger would already be sitting beneath the old shelter, watching the road with the same unwavering faith he had carried for years. Ethan slipped the letter into the mailbox and listened as it fell inside. A small sound. Barely noticeable. Yet somehow it felt like the beginning of something much larger. For the first time in a very long time, the distance between a waiting dog and a missing promise had become just a little bit smaller. 7 days passed. Then 10. Every morning, Ranger continued his journey to the bus stop. Every morning, Ethan accompanied him from a distance. Nothing changed on the road. No unfamiliar vehicles. No mysterious visitors. Only the same faithful routine repeated beneath the growing colors of autumn. Yet something had changed inside Ethan. He no longer viewed the ritual as sad. He viewed it as remarkable. Most people would have given up after weeks. Many would have surrendered after months. Ranger had carried his hope through years. On the 11th day after mailing the letter, Ethan returned home to find a large envelope waiting in his mailbox. The return address belonged to the recovery center in Montana. For several seconds he simply stood there staring at it. The evening sun cast long shadows across the driveway. A cool breeze stirred the leaves around his feet. Carefully, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first line stopped him cold. "Dear Ethan, I do not know how to begin this letter because I never expected to hear Ranger's name again." Ethan sat down on the porch steps and continued reading. Noah explained that 4 years earlier, his life had unraveled after a series of personal losses and struggles that left him isolated and overwhelmed. Feeling unable to care properly for Ranger, he had made the painful decision to leave Cedar Creek and enter a veterans recovery program. A close friend had promised to temporarily care for the dog until Noah regained stability. But somewhere along the way, communication failed. The friend moved away unexpectedly. Phone numbers changed. Addresses disappeared. By the time Noah was finally able to search for Ranger, there was no trace of him. Shelter records, animal registries, local contacts. Nothing. It was as though the dog had vanished. Ethan swallowed hard and kept reading. Near the end of the letter, Noah admitted something that made Ethan's chest tighten. Every month for 4 years, he had written Ranger a letter he could never send. Some were only a few sentences long. Others stretched across several pages. In every one, he promised the same thing. "I never stopped looking for you." Ethan lowered the pages and stared toward the horizon. The evening sky glowed orange and gold beyond the rooftops of Cedar Creek. After a moment, he noticed another item tucked inside the envelope. A photograph. It showed Noah standing beside Ranger years earlier near the old bus stop. On the back was a handwritten message. "Wait for me, buddy. I will come back." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Suddenly the carved name beneath the bench made sense. The waiting made sense. The years made sense. The next morning, before sunrise, Ethan brought the photograph to the bus stop. Ranger arrived as usual and settled beneath the shelter. Ethan sat beside him on the worn wooden bench. For a while neither moved. Then Ethan placed the photograph gently on the seat between them. Ranger glanced toward it. The reaction was immediate. His ears lifted. His body stiffened. Slowly, he leaned forward and touched the picture with his nose. The German Shepherd remained perfectly still afterward, staring at Noah's face. Minutes passed. Then something Ethan had never seen before happened. Ranger stood and walked to the edge of the road. Not because he heard a vehicle. Not because someone was approaching. It was almost as though he sensed that somewhere far beyond the horizon, the promise he had protected for all these years was finally finding its way home. 3 days later, Ethan received a phone call just after sunrise. He was cleaning kennels at Cedar Creek Animal Shelter when his phone vibrated in his pocket. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment he almost ignored it. Then he answered. A quiet voice greeted him from the other end. Older than he expected. Weary, but steady. "Ethan Walker?" Ethan froze. Ranger lifted his head from across the room as though he sensed something shifting in the air. "Yes," Ethan replied. There was a long silence before the voice spoke again. "This is Noah Bennett." Ethan slowly sat down on a nearby bench. Outside, rain tapped softly against the shelter windows. For several moments neither man knew what to say. The years between them felt larger than the 1,000 miles separating Montana from Cedar Creek. Finally Noah spoke. "Is he really still there?" Ethan looked toward Ranger. The German Shepherd was watching him now with calm brown eyes. "Every day," Ethan answered quietly. "Every single day." The line became silent again. Ethan thought the call had disconnected. Then he heard a sharp breath. Noah was crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just the kind of tears that come when a person has carried regret for too many years. Over the next hour they talked. Noah explained that after leaving Cedar Creek, he spent years rebuilding a life he barely believed could be rebuilt. He found work at a woodworking shop near a small Montana town. He rented a modest cabin. He learned how to sleep without fear. How to wake without running from yesterday. Yet one wound never healed. Ranger. Every birthday. Every Christmas. Every quiet evening by the fireplace. The absence remained. Ethan listened carefully. There was no bitterness in Noah's voice. Only sorrow and hope. Before ending the call, Noah made a promise. "I am coming home." 2 days later another envelope arrived. Inside were recent photographs. Ethan spread them across his kitchen table that evening. In one picture, Noah stood beside a mountain lake. His hair carried streaks of gray now. Fine lines framed his eyes. Life had changed him. But the expression was unmistakable. Ethan recognized the same gentle smile from the old newspaper clipping. The same man Ranger had never forgotten. The following morning Ethan carried the photographs to the bus stop. The sky hung low with silver clouds. Ranger settled beside him beneath the weathered shelter. Ethan placed the newest photograph on the bench. For several seconds nothing happened. Then Ranger leaned closer. His nose brushed the image once. Twice. His tail moved slowly against the wooden boards. Ethan felt a chill travel through him. It was impossible to explain. The dog had not seen Noah in years. Yet something deep inside him seemed to recognize what his eyes were seeing. That afternoon another call arrived. Noah sounded different this time. Lighter. Almost nervous. He had purchased a plane ticket to Colorado and arranged transportation back to Cedar Creek. He would arrive in less than a week. After hanging up, Ethan drove to the bus stop one last time before sunset. Ranger sat beneath the bench as golden light spilled across the empty road. The familiar waiting place looked unchanged. The cracked pavement. The faded sign. The field stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. Yet Ethan sensed that the chapter of waiting was ending. Somewhere far away, a man was finally moving toward a promise he thought he had lost forever. And for the first time in years, Ranger was no longer waiting alone. 6 days later, Cedar Creek woke beneath a sky washed clean by overnight rain. The air smelled of wet grass and fresh earth. A pale morning sun rose slowly above the fields beyond County Road 12. Ethan arrived at the bus stop before dawn. Ranger was already there. As always. Sitting beneath the weathered shelter. Watching the empty road. Waiting. Ethan settled beside him on the old wooden bench. Neither moved much. Neither needed to. Some moments carried their own language. The morning passed quietly. A few pickup trucks rolled by. A school bus appeared in the distance and disappeared again. Wind rustled through the dry prairie grass. Ranger remained alert through it all. Then, shortly after 10 o'clock, Ethan noticed a dark SUV approaching from the far end of the road. At first it seemed no different from any other vehicle. But Ranger reacted immediately. His ears lifted. His body stiffened. A low sound escaped his throat. Not fear. Not uncertainty. Recognition. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. The SUV slowed and pulled onto the gravel shoulder near the bus stop. For a second nobody moved. The engine shut off. Silence settled across the road. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. His hair was grayer now. His face older. Life had written its story across him in fine lines and quiet scars invisible to everyone except time itself. Yet Ethan knew instantly. Noah Bennett. Ranger stood frozen. The world seemed to stop around him. Noah took a single step forward. His eyes locked onto the German Shepherd. For several seconds neither moved. Years of separation hung between them like a fragile bridge. Then Noah spoke softly. "Hey, buddy." The words were barely louder than the wind. But they were enough. Ranger exploded forward. Not with wild energy. Not with chaos. With certainty. Pure certainty. He crossed the distance in seconds and reached Noah just as the former Marine dropped to one knee. The dog pressed against him so hard that Noah nearly lost his balance. Noah wrapped both arms around Ranger's neck and buried his face into the thick fur. Ethan looked away for a moment. Some reunions felt too sacred to witness directly. Around them, the world continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Birds drifted across the sky. Wind moved through the fields. Sunlight warmed the pavement. Yet something extraordinary had happened. A promise had survived. Noah remained kneeling for a long time. One hand resting on Ranger's shoulder. The other holding the old dog tag Ethan had returned to him earlier that morning. Finally Noah looked toward Ethan. Neither man spoke immediately. Words seemed unnecessary. Noah eventually stood and walked over. "Thank you," he said quietly. Ethan shook his head. "You do not owe me thanks. He waited for you. Noah glanced back at Ranger. The German shepherd was standing beside the bench now, tail moving gently, eyes never leaving his person. Tears filled Noah's eyes again. This time they carried no regret. Only gratitude. As the afternoon sun stretched long shadows across County Road 12, Noah opened the SUV door. Ranger jumped inside without hesitation. No looking back. No uncertainty. Home was no longer a place. It was a person. Ethan watched the vehicle disappear beyond the horizon until it became a small shape against the endless American sky. The old bus stop stood empty at last. But somehow it did not feel abandoned. It felt fulfilled. Because sometimes loyalty is stronger than time. Sometimes love remembers what the world forgets. And sometimes the soul that refuses to stop waiting becomes the very reason a lost soul finds the way home.